Her grandfather's name was on the 1960 baptism list, but he was born in 1955. Before we begin, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for being here, for taking time not just to watch, but to take care of the body that's carried you this far. It started with a list, a baptismal record, brittle at the edges, its ink faded like breath on glass. It was the kind of document most people wouldn't even glance at. A crinkled page inside a dusty ledger stored in the back room of St. Emery's Catholic Church, a place where time had settled like old incense. But for Elise Harper, it was the thread that began to unravel her family's entire story. She had only come to the church for a genealogy project. It was a quiet afternoon in October, the kind that smells like dried leaves and distant wood smoke. She'd volunteered to help the church digitize their sacramental records, thinking it would be a short stint of scanning and labeling. Something light, something forgettable. But as her fingers turned that particular page, dated May 8th, 1960, her eyes paused over a name that stopped her breath mid-thought. John Harper, her grandfather's name. Except he wasn't baptized in 1960. He was born in 1955. She knew that. Everyone in her family knew that. It was one of those facts that seemed carved in stone. He'd always joked that he was born in the same year Disneyland opened, 1955. No one questioned it. There were photos, a baby book, school reports, birthday cakes with candles counted just right. Yet here it was. John Harper, baptized May 8th, 1960. She blinked, looked again. But it was there, in that unmistakable cursive of the parish secretary, next to a notation that read, "Foundling, transferred from St. Augustine's orphanage." The room suddenly felt colder. She didn't want to make assumptions. Maybe there was another John Harper. Maybe the handwriting was misread. Maybe it was a clerical error. She clung to those maybes as she photocopied the page, slid it into a manila folder, and promised herself she'd check the birth records later. But later came quickly. That night, she sat with her grandfather over dinner, his silver hair catching the soft light of the kitchen. He was telling his usual story about how he once caught a baseball from Sandy Koufax at a Dodgers game. His voice still carried the timbre of someone who had learned early how to make people laugh. It made what she had to ask feel like a betrayal. "Grandpa," she said, carefully, "do you know if you were ever baptized?" He stopped chewing. "Baptized? Yeah. I guess so. Catholic school and all. Why?" She pulled out the photocopy, unfolding it slowly like she was revealing a wound. He stared at it, then laughed. But it wasn't a full laugh. It was nervous, searching for air. "Huh," he said. "Well, now that's something. Must be another John Harper." His fork moved the food around his plate, untouched. The clock ticked behind them, a second hand scraping the silence. "You were born in 1955, right?" she asked. "That's right." "But this says you were baptized in 1960 and transferred from an orphanage." She watched the color drain from his face. He stood up. "Who asked you to dig into this?" he said, not loud, but sharp. "I was just helping the church digitize records. I wasn't looking for anything." He looked down at the paper again, as if it might change if he stared long enough. Your great-grandmother never told me anything, but I always felt. He trailed off, sat back down slowly. His hands trembled as he folded the paper and handed it back. I don't remember much before I was 5. Elise didn't speak. Neither did he. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the strange, fragile way truth could hide inside families. It didn't always scream. Sometimes it just waited, buried in ledgers and beneath the skin of people you thought you knew. She called the archdiocese the next morning. They confirmed the record. John Harper, baptized at St. Emery's, born on January 3rd, 1955. Arrived from St. Augustine's orphanage on April 27th, 1960. She asked if she could access records from the orphanage. The woman on the other end hesitated. Ma'am, that facility closed in the early 70s. Most of its records were boxed and transferred to our historical archives in Chicago. Elise booked a flight that night. The archive building stood like a monolith of brick and memory. Rows of steel cabinets and yellowing folders. It smelled like dust and old glue. She met with a woman named Therese, a volunteer archivist with eyes that looked like they'd read 1,000 secrets. Therese pulled a file marked Harper John, transferred, from the back cabinet. Inside were 2 photographs, one of a baby boy, another of a different child, same age, labeled Gregory S. On the back of Gregory's photo was a handwritten note. Transferred identity to Harper file, per request, 1960. Elise stared at it, her blood running cold. What did it mean to transfer an identity? And why would anyone do that to a child? Therese was quiet, then leaned in. This isn't uncommon, she said softly. In that era, Catholic orphanages sometimes re-registered children to place them faster into adoptive families, especially if the child's original records were missing or if there was stigma around their birth. Elise couldn't believe what she was hearing. So, my grandfather might not be who he thinks he is? It's possible that your grandfather was assigned someone else's name, or vice versa. Everything she knew about her family felt like it had been placed under a different name, on a different line, in someone else's story. She took photos of the documents, thanked Therese, and walked out into the wind, like someone who had stepped into the middle of a novel without knowing the first chapter. Back home, she didn't know how to tell him. How do you explain to someone that they might be the ghost of another boy's life? But the moment she stepped into his house, he was already sitting at the table, the baptism record beside him, and an old envelope she hadn't seen before. He slid it toward her. The paper trembled. I found this in a box your great-grandmother kept locked, he said. Inside was a letter dated May 1960. John was sick. He didn't make it. But this one, he looks like him. They said no one would know, that it was kinder this way. I agreed. I thought love could be enough. Elise felt her knees weaken. Her grandfather had been raised as a replacement. A child lost. A child given. A name passed like heirloom china. He closed his eyes. So who am I? He asked, but not to her. It was a whisper to the ceiling, to the past, to whatever piece of himself had just crumbled. The wind outside rose suddenly, brushing the windows like the breath of someone long gone. Just as Elise opened her mouth to answer and realized she didn't know where the story ended or where it began. He didn't speak for a full day. Elise stayed. She slept on the living room couch with her jacket for a blanket and her phone still clutched in her hand, as if the answers might come buzzing through the screen. But there was only silence, thick and hollow, broken now and then by the soft creak of the old radiator or the sound of her grandfather pacing upstairs, his footsteps uneven, like memory itself had made him limp. She thought she heard him cry once, not loud, not sobbing, just a sharp exhale, the kind that escapes when something inside breaks so suddenly it can't be held back. Then, silence again. In the morning, she found him sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and a folded newspaper he hadn't read. "I don't want pity," he said without looking at her. "I know. And I don't want stories from strangers telling me who I am." She nodded. He finally met her eyes. "But I need to know if I was stolen." The word made her chest ache. Not lost, not adopted, stolen. It tasted bitter and raw, like something rotten beneath the surface of sweetness. She reached into her bag and pulled out the orphanage records again. The 2 photos, the note, the letter his mother had hidden away like an unanswered prayer. "I think your mother thought she was doing the right thing," Elise said gently. "Maybe she really believed you'd have a better life this way, that love could fix whatever lines had been crossed." He looked at the baby photo. Gregory S. A child with soft curls and a dimpled chin. Familiar, and yet not. "I don't remember being him," he whispered. "You were so young. It's not your fault." He ran a hand through his hair and stared out the window. "All this time, I thought my past was quiet because I had a peaceful childhood, but now I wonder if it was just erased." Elise didn't respond. She couldn't. Later that afternoon, they drove together, back to St. Emery's. The church sat beneath a gray sky, its stone walls streaked with years of rain and quiet regret. Father Doyle, the parish priest, met them at the door. He had kind eyes, the kind that had seen too much and learned how to hold sorrow without flinching. "We're hoping," Elise said, "to understand more about what happened, about why his baptism was recorded 5 years late, why it says he came from an orphanage." Father Doyle nodded and led them through the old nave, the air thick with candle wax and thyme. In the back office, he opened a locked cabinet and pulled out another ledger, this one older, with a cracked leather cover and pages that smelled like stories. He flipped to 1960. "There were 5 baptisms that week," he said softly. "2 were from the orphanage. One of them was your grandfather." He slid the page toward them, and there it was again. "Harper, John, foundling, transferred from St. Augustine's." In the margin, in smaller script, someone had written a note. "Placement expedited. Family approved. No further inquiry." Elise's hands tightened. "Who wrote this?" she asked. Father Doyle squinted. "It looks like Monsignor Tully's handwriting. He ran the parish back then, very involved in expedited adoptions." "What does that mean?" her grandfather asked. The priest looked uneasy. During the 50s and 60s, the church sometimes worked quietly to place orphaned or unwanted children into homes without drawing attention, especially when the biological parents were unmarried, or if there were circumstances the church considered scandalous. Names were changed, baptism records adjusted. It wasn't illegal, exactly, but morally gray. Her grandfather stood motionless, his jaw tight. So I was a scandal. Father Doyle stepped closer. You were a child. What happened to you wasn't your fault, but it was hidden, yes, and for that, I'm sorry. There was a moment, a long one, where no one breathed. Then Elise's grandfather said, I want to see where they kept me, the orphanage, St. Augustine's. Father Doyle hesitated. It's been abandoned for years, condemned. I still want to go. So they did. The drive took over an hour. The building sat at the edge of town, behind a chain-link fence and wild overgrowth. The sign above the rusted gate still read, St. Augustine's Home for Children, though the paint was cracked and faded, and ivy clung to its corners like a secret trying to stay hidden. Elise boosted the latch. The fence creaked open. Inside, the halls were dark and silent. The wallpaper peeled like shedding skin, and the air was filled with the scent of mold and something older, something like grief. Her grandfather moved slowly, tracing his fingers along the corridor walls as though trying to read the past through touch. They found the nursery first. Rows of cribs, now empty. Toys frozen mid-play. A wooden rocking horse missing one eye. On the far wall, a mural of angels reaching down through the clouds. He stared at the mural for a long time. I keep seeing flashes, he said. A white blanket. A smell, like lavender and soap. A song in Latin. But it's like trying to hold on to smoke. They moved deeper into the building. In a storage room, Elise spotted a filing cabinet half swallowed by decay. She yanked it open. Inside, folders, hundreds of them. She rifled through the G section. There it was. Gregory S. She opened the file. Inside was a single page, date of birth, notes on temperament, a short health report, and one line under disposition, assigned to Harper ID May 1960. Assigned, like a number. Her stomach turned. Her grandfather stood behind her, silent, reading. Then he said, We have to find out who Gregory really was. They left the building in silence. The sun was beginning to set, throwing long shadows across the grass. A wind picked up, tossing leaves into the air, and Elise thought about how truth, real truth, never comes all at once. It arrives in pieces, like puzzle fragments you find years apart, and only later do you realize they were part of the same picture. In the car, her grandfather whispered, If I wasn't John Harper, then maybe Gregory had a family. Maybe someone out there's been missing him this whole time. Elise nodded. And maybe, she said, they never knew what happened to him. As they drove away from the orphanage, the last light of day cast their reflections against the windshield. Two people, bound not by blood, but by a mystery that refused to stay buried. In that reflection, Elise thought she saw something shift in her grandfather's expression. Not despair, but resolve. As if he'd spent his whole life wearing someone else's name and had just realized it was finally time to give it back. They started with the name, Gregory S. It was all they had. A single initial, written hastily on a fading file, like someone had tried to remember a boy long enough to forget him. Elise stared at the page again that night in her apartment, scanning for clues. There was no last name, no photo beyond the baby picture, just a date of birth, January 3rd, 1955. and a hand-drawn star next to the word undocumented. She'd never realized how loud silence could be until she tried to trace a life that had been deliberately erased. She logged onto every genealogy site she could find, built a timeline, cross-referenced names of infants born in Los Angeles County that week. Still, Gregory was like a whisper in a sealed room. Felt, but not found. Her grandfather sat on the couch behind her, still in the same flannel shirt from that morning, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea he hadn't touched. "I keep thinking," he said quietly, "what if Gregory wasn't just some orphan? What if he was taken from someone? What if they stole him to replace me?" Elise turned to him. "We don't know that yet. But it's possible, isn't it?" She didn't want to say yes, but he already knew. The next day, they drove to the county records office. Elise had made an appointment with a records officer named Michelle, who greeted them with cautious sympathy, the kind of practiced gentleness used with people who've walked in with more questions than answers. "We don't usually have orphanage records here," Michelle explained, pulling up a database on her screen. "But if there was a death certificate for the original John Harper, it might be here. That could help us separate the two identities." Elise hadn't even thought of that. Michelle typed, scrolled, and then paused. "There is one," she said, turning the screen slightly. "John Michael Harper. Died April 2nd, 1960. Cause, pneumonia. Age, 5 years." Her grandfather leaned forward. "That's the same month the baptism record says I arrived." Michelle nodded slowly. It all clicked. The real John Harper had died in April, and within weeks, a boy named Gregory was reassigned to his name, reborn on paper, as if the original child's death had simply made room. "Who signed off on this?" Elise asked. Michelle printed the certificate. "Next of kin, Margaret Harper, mother, and Monsignor Tully as witness." They thanked her and walked out in silence. The hallway echoed as they moved, the pages in Elise's hand trembling slightly. Outside, her grandfather stopped walking. "My mother lost a child," he said, "and she said yes to replacing him." Elise gently touched his arm. "I don't think she was trying to erase him. I think she was trying not to drown." He shook his head. "But what does that make me? A bandage? A secret?" She didn't have an answer. That night, she opened the baby book her grandfather had kept for decades. It was worn and yellowed. Inside, a lock of hair in a wax envelope, a hospital wristband labeled John H., and a note taped beside a photograph. Home, April 1960. Everything aligned. The date, the name, the sudden appearance of a son. But what caught her was the handwriting, different from the rest. As if someone else had filled in those first pages, then left her great-grandmother to continue the story. "Do you think she ever regretted it?" Elise asked. Her grandfather didn't answer. He just stared out the window, as if trying to remember the shape of her face, his mother's, before the lie became the only thing holding them together. The next day, Elise made another call. She reached out to the archdiocese again, asking for any remaining records tied to Gregory S., even if just fragments. A week passed, and then an envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a photocopy of a letter dated 1954 from a woman named Celeste Sinclair, a birth mother. It had been addressed to the orphanage. "I know I should not have come to your doorstep," it read, in looping script, "but I had nowhere else. My family won't have me. The father is gone. Please, just give him a name. Let him be more than my mistake." Elise read it 3 times, then flipped the page. Attached was a note scribbled in pencil. Infant male, born January 3rd, 1955. Temporary name, Gregory Sinclair. She felt her breath catch. There it was, Gregory's last name, Sinclair. "Grandpa," she whispered, handing him the paper. "I think we found his mother." He stared at it, lips parted slightly, like the letters themselves were too heavy to say aloud. "Do you want to find her?" He looked at her. "I think I have to." So Elise started digging again, this time with a last name. She combed census records, death registries, even old neighborhood directories. Finally, she found a lead. Celeste Sinclair, last known address in Modesto, California. Deceased, 1999. But there was more. Survived by one daughter, Grace Sinclair Thomas. Her grandfather read the name twice, lips moving slowly. Would she be my sister? Elise didn't answer. Not yet. Not until they knew more. They tracked Grace to a house just outside Sacramento, a yellow 2-story with a porch swing and a lemon tree in the yard. Elise watched her grandfather from the passenger seat as they parked. He looked older in that moment, smaller somehow, like a boy who was about to knock on a door that might open to the rest of his life, or close on it forever. "Ready?" she asked. He nodded. They walked up the steps, knocked. A woman in her late 60s answered the door. Her eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in confusion. She looked at Elise, then at her grandfather. "I'm sorry," she said. "Do I know you?" Elise stepped forward. "This might sound strange," she said carefully, "but we think your mother may have had a son she gave up in 1955. The woman froze. "My mother?" she whispered. "She talked about a baby once. Just once. Said she had to give him away, that she wasn't allowed to hold him. She cried when she said it, and then she never brought it up again." Elise's grandfather took a shaky breath. "I think that baby was me." Grace looked at him, really looked. Her hand went to her mouth, and tears filled her eyes before she even realized she was crying. "You have her eyes," she said. They stood there, the 3 of them, on a porch that had never expected to hold a reunion. Time didn't collapse, exactly. It folded gently, like 2 pages of the same book, finally meeting at the spine. Grace invited them in. They sat, they talked. And as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Elise felt something in the air loosen, some invisible thread that had been pulled tight for decades finally letting go. Her grandfather said very little. But when Grace showed him a photo of their mother in her 20s, he reached out and traced the corner of the frame with his fingertip. "She wasn't trying to forget me," he said softly. "She was trying to protect me." And in that moment, Elise realized something. Sometimes, the truth doesn't come with lightning or rage. Sometimes, it arrives like this, with quiet hands, familiar faces, and the simple, aching grace of being seen. The drive home was silent at first, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. The road wound gently through golden fields and dusky shadows, and Elise kept her eyes on the horizon, giving her grandfather the space to breathe. He stared out the passenger window, still clutching the small photograph of Celeste Sinclair, his birth mother. She was standing beside a parked bicycle, hair curled, sunlight falling across her cheek like a promise. The black and white image looked like something from another world, yet it held a tenderness that made him ache. A face he'd never seen, yet somehow always carried. She rode her bike to work, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. Grace said she used to deliver letters at the post office, rain or shine. Elise nodded softly. She was strong, he added, and kind. He said it like he remembered her, even though he couldn't have. But memory, Elise realized, wasn't always built on experience. Sometimes it was born in the quiet spaces, the unspoken gestures, the familiar way someone's eyes looked in a photo. Sometimes it was built backward from longing. When they reached home, the sky was the color of ash and rust. A storm was rolling in slowly, the way old grief sometimes does. Quiet, but certain. Elise helped him inside, made tea, and placed the photo on the mantel next to a faded picture of his adoptive mother, Margaret Harper. Two women, two versions of the beginning. One who gave him life, and one who gave him a name. That night, sleep did not come easily. He sat in the dark, listening to the house breathe around him. It was strange, he thought, how a name could be both a shelter and a lie. He'd lived decades as John Harper, built a life, raised a family, paid taxes, made jokes, suffered losses. That name had become his skin. But now, in the stillness of night, he wondered if some part of him had always belonged to someone else. To Gregory. To a shadow. He opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside were folded newspaper clippings, yellowed with time, his old report cards. A ticket stub from the first concert he ever took Elise's mother to. And at the bottom, a sealed envelope, unmarked. He stared at it. He didn't remember putting it there. He tore it open gently. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten. The ink smeared slightly, as if someone had cried while writing. It read, "If you're reading this, it means the truth found you. I did what I thought would save us. After John died, I couldn't breathe. I couldn't eat. Then they brought you in, quiet, watching everything, and something in me believed that maybe God was giving me another chance. But it wasn't fair to you, and I know that now. I loved you every day. But I'm sorry for the name. I'm sorry for the lie." There was no signature, but he knew the handwriting. Margaret. He folded the paper slowly, pressing it against his chest like a balm that burned. The next morning, Elise found him in the kitchen, staring into a cup of black coffee gone cold. "Did you sleep?" she asked. He shook his head. "But I remembered something." He stood up and went to the coat closet, reached behind a stack of old boots and umbrellas, pulled out a small wooden box, carved with crosses on each side. Inside, wrapped in a yellowed cloth, was a tiny bracelet made of hospital beads. The name tag was long missing, but the initials, GS, were etched faintly into one of the beads. "I remember this," he said, "not from pictures, from touch. I used to roll it in my fingers at night when I couldn't sleep. It's the only thing I had when I came to the house." Elise took the bracelet, her throat tightening. You held on to it. He nodded. I think some part of me knew I was someone else. Later that week, they returned to St. Augustine's, the old orphanage, or what remained of it. The building had long been shuttered, its windows boarded, its gates locked. The archdiocese had scheduled it for demolition within the year, but they received special permission to visit just once before it was gone. The halls echoed with absence, peeling paint, broken floorboards, a rusted tricycle in the corner of what must have been a nursery. Elise walked slowly, photographing everything, as if trying to trap the ghosts inside pixels. Her grandfather lingered by the chapel doors. He stepped inside alone. It was dark, except for the dusty light filtering through a cracked stained glass window. An image of St. Michael with a sword raised, his wings arched in defiance. The pews were warped, the altar cracked, but he walked down the aisle like a boy chasing memory. Near the front, he sat, folded his hands, and let the silence speak. He didn't cry, he just closed his eyes and whispered, I forgive you. Elise watched from the doorway, heart full of ache and awe. There was something sacred about witnessing a man forgive two mothers, one who lied to save herself and one who was forced to give him away. Something sacred in a man reclaiming not just a name, but a self. On the way home, they didn't talk much, but the silence felt different now, not hollow, just full. As they pulled into the driveway, her grandfather looked at her and asked, Do you think I should tell the rest of the family? She hesitated. I think it's your story. You get to decide how it's told, he nodded. But that night, he called Elise's mother. They talked for hours, and in the morning, he sat down with a pen and began writing everything, his memories, the letters, the photos. He didn't stop until the sun was high. When Elise found him, he was folding the last page into an envelope marked, For when I'm gone. Why wait? She asked gently. He smiled, because sometimes the truth is a seed. It needs time. She placed the envelope in the drawer beside his favorite sweater. Then, without speaking, they stepped outside together. The sky was open, wide and impossibly blue, and for the first time in weeks, her grandfather walked without the weight of wondering who he was. Because now, he knew. He had been John. He had been Gregory. But more than anything else, he had been loved. And that, Elise thought, would always be the truest name of all. The envelope sat in the drawer for weeks. Sometimes, Elise would catch her grandfather standing near it, fingers grazing the edge, as if he was waiting for the right breath and time to open it again. Other days, he didn't even look its way. Life had returned to a slow rhythm. Morning coffee, crossword puzzles, visits from neighbors who still called him John, with no idea their friend had just uncovered the quiet theft of his past. But not all things stay quiet. One morning, the phone rang. It was a woman's voice, shaky, soft. Is this the Harper residence? Elise answered, glancing toward the living room where her grandfather sat reading the paper. Yes, who's calling? There was a pause. My name is Margaret Sinclair. I think I may be related to someone there. I I saw the post. Elise's heart dropped. 3 days earlier, she had uploaded a simple image to a private ancestry board. The baptism record, a cropped photo of the bracelet with the initials GS, and a short caption, searching for any relatives connected to a child born Gregory S., January 1955, Catholic orphanage, St. Augustine's, re-registered under a different name in 1960. Any info appreciated. That was all. She hadn't expected much. Maybe a message from another amateur genealogist. Maybe a nudge in the right direction. But not this. Gregory was my brother, the woman said, voice cracking. We were both placed in St. Augustine's. I was adopted out in 1959. I never knew what happened to him. Elise sat down slowly. Can I ask? Did you know his full name? Gregory Sinclair? Elise closed her eyes. She asked the woman if she could meet. They agreed to drive out halfway between their homes. An old diner off Route 47, nestled between cornfields and memory. Elise told her grandfather everything. He listened without a word. Then he stood, went to his closet, and put on his nicest sweater. When they arrived, the woman was already waiting in a booth by the window, a teacup clutched between trembling fingers. She had kind eyes, gray curls tucked under a scarf, and a small silver cross at her throat. She looked up as they entered and froze. Greg? She whispered, barely breathing the name. He didn't answer. He just walked toward her, slowly, like someone approaching a long-lost mirror. She stood up, her face breaking open with something that looked like hope mixed with grief. You look just like our father, she said. Elise watched as her grandfather, Gregory, now fully named, placed a hand gently on the table between them. His eyes shimmered. I didn't know I had a sister, he said, voice hoarse. Margaret, his sister, smiled through tears. I didn't know you were still alive. They sat for hours. She brought photos, faded, black and white, some in color. One of a boy with a gap-toothed smile she remembered as Gregory. Another of their mother, Celeste, holding them both on a front porch Elise had only seen in archives. I think she died thinking we'd both been adopted together, Margaret said quietly. I didn't even know, until I turned 30, that I was ever in an orphanage. My adoptive parents never told me. They shared stories, piecing together fragments of two separate lives that had once started in the same cradle. And when Elise asked the question that had been sitting on her tongue all day, why do you think they changed his name? Margaret's face darkened. There were whispers, she said, lowering her voice, that a child with health issues had died at the orphanage, and that sometimes they didn't report it. Elise felt the air shift. You think Gregory was switched? Because another boy named John had passed? Margaret nodded slowly. It wasn't uncommon. Catholic records were sacred, but also easy to hide behind. If a healthy child was available, and someone powerful wanted a replacement, well, orphanages had too many mouths and not enough beds. They sat in silence after that, heavy, but not broken. That night, Gregory, no longer John alone, stood in his kitchen and stared at himself in the mirror. A new name resting alongside the old. Two stories layered like vellum. I don't know who I've been all this time, he said aloud. Elise, standing behind him, replied gently. Both. You've been both. He nodded, then turned to her. I want to tell the rest of the family now. So they did. First, Elise's mother, then her uncles, then the grandchildren. Some were shocked, some confused, but none turned away, because the man who sat before them, The man who had built their family was still the same, just with more truth now living behind his eyes. It was Margaret who helped him reconnect with the rest of his biological relatives: a cousin in Kansas, an aunt in Michigan, a half-brother he never knew existed in Chicago, who sent a letter filled with old photos and a single sentence scrawled in bold ink. "Welcome home, Gregory. We've been missing you without knowing it." Weeks passed. Autumn ripened into winter. And on Christmas Eve, Gregory sat in front of the fireplace, surrounded by family, both old and new. He held a cup of cider, eyes shining from the glow of the lights, and watched Elise hang a small ornament on the tree. It was handmade, stitched with his original initials, GS. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" She smiled. "For finding the boy I forgot I was." Elise leaned down, kissed his cheek. He never left. He was just waiting for someone to remind him. And for the first time in a long time, the house felt full. Not just of people, but of clarity, of roots restored, of names honored, of a man who once walked in shadow, now sitting in light. Spring came slowly that year. Snow lingered on the sidewalks like forgotten thoughts. The trees waited longer than usual to bloom, as if the world itself had paused to catch its breath. But inside the Harper home, no, the Sinclair home, as they now sometimes said, with gentle humor, there was a warmth that couldn't be dimmed. Gregory Sinclair had started to write. Not a memoir, not exactly, just pages of memory, scraps of stories. A baseball game in 1967, where he missed a pop fly and laughed anyway. The way his mother, adoptive, still beloved, used to hum when she cooked. And the first time he saw his granddaughter, Elise, asleep in his arms. Each line was written in a small leather notebook, the kind with a cloth ribbon between the pages and corners curled like old leaves. He called it Both Names, because that's what he was now. Both. One afternoon, Elise came over to help him organize some of his things. Boxes were stacked in the den. Old documents, Christmas cards, photo albums with names now annotated in careful handwriting. Margaret had sent more photographs recently. Some of their mother, Celeste, in a nurse's uniform. One of Gregory himself as a baby in a stroller marked St. Augustine's. It was the first time he had seen his own face from before the Harper name. "You sure you want to keep all this?" Elise asked, holding up a yellowed folder. He nodded. "It's not for me. It's for whoever comes next." They worked in quiet rhythm, interrupted only by music from an old radio playing Nat King Cole. At one point, Elise paused and turned to him. "Do you regret knowing?" He looked up from a box of letters. "No," he said simply. "I regret not knowing sooner. But not knowing? No." He closed the box gently, hands lingering on its surface. "I've loved the life I lived, but now I understand it. And there's peace in that." Elise smiled, though her eyes shimmered. Some people live their whole lives without ever understanding where they came from. He reached over, patted her hand. "Some people never have someone like you to help them look." Later that week, they went back to St. Emery's. It was quiet when they arrived. Just the echo of their steps and the faint scent of melted wax. Gregory stood in the same aisle where his baptism had been recorded. He hadn't set foot inside the sanctuary since the truth had surfaced. It felt like walking into a version of himself that had never existed, and yet somehow always had. They approached the back room where the ledgers were kept. Elise asked the parish priest if she could see the baptism record again. He nodded kindly, and there it was. That same cursive entry: John Harper, baptized May 8th, 1960, transferred from St. Augustine's. But this time, Elise carried a red pen. She didn't change the original. She just added a notation in the margin. See also, Gregory Sinclair, born Jan 3, 1955. Historical correction, acknowledged with family permission. Documented 2025. The priest watched her, then nodded. History deserves the truth, he said. Gregory stood behind her, one hand on the back of the wooden chair. He wasn't crying, but there was something deeper in his expression than tears. Something like release. That night, Elise uploaded one final post to the genealogy board. Update: Gregory Sinclair and John Harper were the same child. One name lost, one given, both loved, both real. Thank you to all who helped us find the full picture. She closed the laptop with quiet finality. Weeks turned into months. Gregory's health began to waver, not dramatically, just the soft edge of age leaning into him. He walked slower, took longer to finish sentences, but he smiled more, laughed more. And every Sunday, he called Margaret. They spoke about everything: old songs, forgotten relatives, the way toast used to taste better when they were kids. He never missed a call. And then came his final entry in the notebook. He wrote it on a Sunday afternoon, the sun slanting just right across his writing desk. I used to wonder what name they'd put on my headstone, but now I think, why choose? I was Gregory before I was John. I was John long enough to become a father, a grandfather, a friend. But Gregory, he's the name that reminds me I was always real, even when the world didn't know it, even when I didn't. If you find this one day, know this: names matter, but truth matters more. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Love people hard enough to dig. You might just find a whole other life waiting for you. He signed it, Gregory John Sinclair, Harper. One spring morning, Elise found him sitting on the back porch, the notebook in his lap, his eyes closed, face lifted toward the breeze. Peaceful, still, gone. They buried him under a dogwood tree in the town cemetery. On the headstone were 3 lines: Gregory John Sinclair, 1955, 2025. A man of both names and one heart. At the memorial, Margaret spoke through tears. I spent my life looking for my brother. It turns out he was always there, in someone's kindness, in someone's stories, in someone's quiet strength. And when I found him again, it was like hearing our mother's voice one last time. After the service, Elise sat on the bench beside his grave, the same notebook in her lap. She didn't cry right away. Instead, she read his last entry again. Then she turned to a blank page and began to write. Today, I buried my grandfather. But I didn't bury a lie. I buried a truth so full, so human, it stretched across 2 names and still had room to grow. He taught me that love can live even in the broken places, that sometimes the name we're given isn't the one we carry, and that healing doesn't always come with answers, but with the courage to ask. This is the story of a man who was lost and found, and finally whole. And as she wrote, the first dogwood blooms opened overhead, white petals catching the wind. Not a beginning, not an ending, just something true, finally planted and beginning to grow.